Good morning, everyone. I want to talk about communism today. So I was reading a piece by Rob Henderson, which I'll break down in a moment, but it really got me thinking how communism isn't taught in American colleges. And I've kind of been on my own personal journey of self-education for the past 2 or 3 years now, trying to learn everything I didn't learn in college. And the more I learn, the more I realize how much of a disservice the college system does to us. Like, we're not actually educated. We're not actually learning things. We're being taught things. We're being informed of what to believe. But we're not actually learning things that we're supposed to learn. So for a little bit of context, I studied international relations, political science, history, and Middle Eastern studies in college. Yes, my focus was on the Middle East, but I dabbled in some other stuff. So I took an entire 14-week course on Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. I did stuff with French history. I took all sorts of different classes, but I never learned much of anything about the Soviet. I took a history class about the Cold War. Now that I think about it, I did. I took an entire history class about the Cold War. I never really learned much though about Stalinism, right? I learned a lot about the Bay of Pigs and Cuba and the Vietnam War. I could tell you all sorts of stuff about that, but I never learned about Stalin's purges. I didn't learn about the famines. There's just so much of history that I didn't learn. And what I'm starting to discover is that this actually might be by design. So one thing that I highlighted here that Rob points out in his essay is that in US high schools, you get 155 hours of Hitler, 3 minutes of Stalin, and 0 on Pol Pot. His essay is about Pol Pot, but I think it speaks to a broader narrative of how little time is actually allocated to teaching different aspects of communism. And I think this is important because, okay, fine, if you just look at Stalinism, that's one outlier. You look at Hitler, you look at kind of the two together within the whole World War II framework, fine. But when you study these in sequentially and in context, you realize there's a pattern. Stalin came to power, there were famines. Mao came to power, there were famines. Pol Pot came to power in Cambodia, there was a famine. You have the Kim Jong-un in North Korea, there's been famines. Wherever communism starts, there's always famines. And the thing that's really important is that we're not taught about the famines in college, right? I learned about Stalin and, you might have read or taken lectures or whatever about the terror and there's Mao's Great Leap Forward, right? You heard about that, the Cultural Revolution. There's things you learn, there's terms, there's definitions, there's points in history, but we're not really taught the outcome. And the outcome is that millions of people die from these things. So one thing I called out here in the in this note I wrote about Rob's essay was the Holodomor. That's a really good example, and I think that's been referenced in the news within the past couple of years because of the conflict in Ukraine. But this is a great example. It's, everyone knows about the Holocaust. How many people know about the Holodomor? I didn't. I actually learned about it. The first time I actually received, that I can consciously remember, the first time I actually received a lecture that talked about the Holodomor in detail was when I took Michael Malice's class, The Rise and Fall of the Soviet Union, on the Peterson Academy, which I highly recommend. A really phenomenal platform. But I learned about that for the first time, and I had never, maybe I'm dumb, I don't know, but I had never contextualized that the 5-year plans that the Stalin's regime had implemented in the 1930s had led to famine. And the reason for this makes sense, right? So under communism, every production is owned by the state and everything is centralized. So you create these 5-year plans. Everyone's like, okay, this is great. This is wonderful. The problem is within communism, pricing doesn't exist. Everything, Marxism looks at things from a value perspective rather than a market supply and demand and pricing perspective. So there's no mechanism within a communist state to allocate resources. And so you have a bunch of bureaucrats, and I'm sure they're well-meaning people, but they sit in offices and they crunch numbers and they make up what they think is supposed to be produced or how much needs to be produced for the population for subsistence level, but they're actually completely divorced from reality. So when Stalin's 5-year plans were implemented, you had all these bureaucrats in Moscow. They collectivized the farmland, so the state took it. The state seized control of the farmland. They kind of redistributed it. They put people to work on the land. It wasn't clear whether or not those people actually had the skills needed to cultivate the land. And a lot of the small private farmers, the kulaks, were actually taken away. They were taken away by and sent to camps, and I think some were killed. I don't remember that whole part of the history. I think some were. But they rounded up all of the people who actually knew how to run the farms, and they got rid of them. So you just had like people, so you had labor that was distributed to these collectivized farms that were held by the state, and you had these bureaucrats in Moscow telling like the farmers what they were supposed to produce. They weren't necessarily giving them the tools they needed, right? Because there was no pricing mechanism to like figure out how to distribute resources and capital. So they weren't able to produce enough to feed the population. And at the same time, this made things worse. There was a famine. So there's a famine in Ukraine. Like the harvests were down, plus like mismanagement within the Soviet economy meant like they weren't able to produce as much food as they needed to. And so what people don't realize is that communism like talks about equality, but there's nothing equal. Like the only equal thing about it is you're not equal in the prosperity that's created from the system. You're equal at the lowest common denominator, which is survival. So there's equality and struggle for survival. There's equality in death. There's equality in imprisonment. There's no equality in success. And again, you have to look at all of these different regimes as a pattern, right? Like Stalin lived in opulence, Kim Jong-un lived in opulence, like Mao was fine. Like the leadership of these regimes are far removed from the suffering of the average people that they claim to represent. We're just like, we're not taught this. Like this is missing from like American history classes and like how we're educated here in the United States. Like we learn about communism in the context of the Cold War and McCarthyism and like, you know, the space race and all this like beating the Soviet Union. Like we don't learn about communism, the economic system, and how like what that leads to. So there's people and you know, there's people who are like communism bad, but it's not really articulated why it's bad. And then I think there's a suppression of the facts, which makes it hard for people to believe and to see what's happening. And so something I wrote here, and this is something I learned very recently. I had no idea any of this, right? So Gareth Jones was like a 29-year-old freelance reporter who literally walked through the countryside. I think he's British. He walked through the countryside in Ukraine, documented the famine as it was happening. Like, people don't understand how bad the famine was or what it meant. It wasn't even just that like the state controlled the means of producing food. It was that if you had food above what you were permitted to have, you were considered a class traitor, an enemy of the state, and you would be arrested. And the whole regime relied on family and friends and neighbors informing on one another, right? So if you think the Gestapo was bad, like I think this was far worse. And so like starvation was the baseline and was the norm. And if you had more, if you had extra seeds, if you had extra resources, you had a surplus of any kind, you were a traitor to the state and you would be taken away. And so that was the options. Either you starve or you go to prison. And in this case, it was to the gulags. But Gareth Jones was a 20-something who was roaming around the Ukrainian countryside, documenting it, and he was filing reports with newspapers at the time. One of those was the New York Times. He tried to publish pieces in there, and the bureau chief in Moscow, Walter Duranty, denounced all of it. This is well documented. You can Google Walter Duranty. This guy won a Pulitzer Prize, by the way. He won a Pulitzer Prize, and it's very clear like he was in Stalin's pocket. And I don't know to what extent like he benefited from Stalinism. Like I don't know if Stalin paid him off. I don't know, right? A lot of people don't know this. But the important part here is that the New York Times has been the paper of record, right? Like history, and in my history curriculum in college, like I did an entire thing where I went through like New York Times and newspaper and primary source documentation of events and had to like do a primary source research paper on it. The New York Times is the paper of record. So usually what the paper of record says tends to be held as the truth. And What's important about this is that the New York Times at that time, under the leadership of Walter Duranty, like, it refused to publish what was happening in Ukraine. It refused to acknowledge the famine that was happening. And so that context, plus, our own recent history today, okay, we know, publications like NPR refused to publish information about the Hunter Biden laptop story, which has since been proven to be true. We know now, looking back, coverage of COVID in the beginning, if you posited the lab leak theory, you were canceled and deplatformed. We know now that is the most likely origin of the COVID-19 pandemic, was a lab leak. The CIA has even confirmed this, right? So we know presently that the media has been covering things up. And clearly here, this is one example. The media has been covering things up in the past. So it begs the question, like, okay, if this has been happening, what else do we not know? What else has been covered up? What else is not being acknowledged? And in a variety of institutions, whether it's the media or higher education, like, what information is deliberately being downplayed or obfuscated so that we are unaware of it? And then, of course, to what purpose, and for what purpose, and why is that happening? So this is the piece that Rob published in his essay, or in his newsletter. It's called Better in Absence of Men Than Imperfect Men. And it's about a new documentary about meeting with Pol Pot. So this whole thing is about Pol Pot. But I think it's worth reading through, because he brings up some really interesting points that may answer the question I posed. And that's, why are we hiding the history of communism? Why are we not teaching it? Why are students not learning it? They're currently being indoctrinated in it, right? Like, you can see it's abundant. Like any leftist protest, if you've been to it recently or seen it or watched it, all the ideologies we're seeing with critical race theory and feminism, right? Like, you're seeing the physical manifestations of Marxist ideology within the cultural sphere, and you're seeing this play out in politics. And you have to ask yourself, like, why? Like, if there's this history of death and destruction in the wake of communism, in the wake of socialism, like, why do we continue to see this play out and people aspire to some utopia that clearly time after time after time again does not exist? And so he writes here, it's really interesting. You see this among affluent socialists today who cosplay poverty in an attempt to manipulate actual poor people into supporting their twisted ideology. And he goes on to say, no one hates elites more than elites or aspirational elites. Too many people mistakenly think that the battle is between the haves and the have-nots. What actually happens is the haves want to seize money from the have-mores, and to do so disguise their malicious desire as concern for the have-nots. And this is, I think, kind of gets at the crux of it. The workers have always been pawns, right? Like I'm working through a course I created on ChatGPT about the history of economic theory. And so I'm reading this book, The Worldly Philosophers by Robert Heilbronner. But I was reading the chapter today about Marx, and something that jumped out at me was Engels, his partner Engels, came from an affluent family and was still benefiting from capitalism while also funding Marx, and Marx had married into an affluent family. So the people who promote Marxism and Marx himself, these people came from affluence. They weren't working class. So the people writing the ideology, they're writing the philosophy and the theories, they're not members of the working class. So they're using the working class as pawns to achieve their objectives. And one thing about Marxism is that it was written in the mid-19th century. And during this period of time, there was a lot of revolutions within continental Europe. And these were probably this was probably the most disruptive political period since the French Revolution, I would say, in 1798. So the mid-1800s, literally when the Communist Manifesto was published, there was revolutions popping off across continental Europe. And so there was a lot of upheaval. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that the emergence of capitalism created a new social order. But I don't want to say it was just capitalism. Capitalism is both an economic system and a political system. And so we often look at the world from a very Eurocentric lens, specifically a British-centered lens. And I don't think we realize that the things that were happening in continental Europe were very different than what was happening in Britain, than what was happening in the United States. So we kind of lump everything together without recognizing how distinct they were. And during this time, like, I think the Prussian Empire was slowly waning. Germany was about to become unified, or had been unified. There was a war with France in the 1870s. So there was a lot happening on continental Europe that would have informed why Marx thought what he thought. And part of all of that change was social in nature. So whereas in Britain, kind of the aristocracy had already faded and had been replaced, didn't quite disappear, but it had been replaced by a capitalist class. In the US, like, we never developed an aristocracy. Like, there were landholding elites, sure, but like average people could own land too. But we never had the rigid social structure of Europe that continental Europe had. And we never had that. So I think that's really important, because for Marxists, like, going from being a have and to a more have or a have more was very important for them. It was very important for how you participated in politics and like the social clout and the social esteem that you got. I think, like, the only comparison, I could think of today is if you're a creator, right? Like, you publish content with the hopes of going viral, and you see how virality can change your life, right? So you think of like someone like Justin Bieber, just like singing on YouTube, gets discovered, boom, boosted into stardom. The D'Amelio sisters start publishing like their stupid dances on TikTok, boom, like they skyrocket into stardom. And I think like that's like our only understanding of kind of quite the change, right? Like, you go from being an average nobody to becoming a somebody. And I think during this time, a lot of continental Europeans wanted to become somebodies, especially like intellectuals and pseudo-intellectual elites, aspirational elites, people who wanted to become someone but weren't quite someone yet. I think they looked for ways to like kind of shoehorn themselves in, if you will, in much the same way like people now leverage social media to kind of get up in society and social class. Like, I think the same thing was happening during this time. And so it's hard for us to conceptualize what all this means, because we don't have this history here, right? But in any case, like, the average person was used and manipulated in order to play out this like chess game that was being played between the upper echelons of society and the people who aspired to be part of that upper echelon of society. And so the workers were just like used for that end. So again, like, he talks here, so the people who, this is important with what I just said with like the elites and stuff, because the people who aspire to be who were like the have more class, were usually these people, your educators, people who weren't quite part of the intelligentsia, but who aspired to be part of the intelligentsia. And they were never curious about what was happening, or they weren't asking questions. They were just kind of like participating in everything as it played out. And oftentimes these were the people who committed the atrocities. So you think of like Nazi Germany, right? Like, it was average people who were committing, a lot of the atrocities at the camps. This is a great example, right, of Pol Pot, and something I haven't dove too deep into, but he killed a fourth of the population, and he was only in power for 3 years, less than 4 years. Okay, 25% of the population was killed. Western intellectuals at the time did all they could to deny what was happening. So they didn't want to acknowledge that a genocide and famine, state a man-made state-generated famine led to a genocide of people. Because the moment they did that, their entire archetype of what an anti-capitalist utopia should be would crumble. And everything they believed in would crumble. So it's better to deny what happens to keep the edifice of what you believe to be true intact than it is to watch the whole house of cards come crumbling down. And I think a lot of people can resonate with this because I think there was a change for a lot of people after COVID. The things we thought were true turned out not to be true. And it has a very destabilizing effect. I mean, it absolutely does. Like, I've definitely felt this way with feminism. Like, everything I thought to be true about what I believed has turned out to be wrong. And the things that I rejected, you know, my religious upbringing, traditional values, are things that actually seem to be true and correct. And so it feels like you have vertigo sometimes, like, and you're constantly grappling with what you think is how the world should be and how it actually is. And so I think for a lot of folks who have the luxury to deny claims and reject things like they do, why wouldn't you? What else? Okay. And so this gets into another piece which I think is really interesting. So he talks about this with regard to confessions. A lot of folks in communist regimes like made false confessions about crimes they didn't commit. But this gets to a broader point. It answers the question here, like, why did Western intellectuals deny what was happening? And that's because you have to get rid of objective truth. So the only way communism exists is if you get rid of objective truth. And you have to accept falsehoods as like a normal way of life. So I read The Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt. I highly recommend reading this. But the book is broken down into 3 sections, and the last one is about totalitarianism. And she writes in here, and this is really fascinating, what makes a truly totalitarian device out of the Bolshevik claim that the present Russian system is superior to all others is the fact that the totalitarian ruler draws from this claim the logically impeccable conclusion that without this system, people never could have built such a wonderful thing as, let us say, a subway. From this, he again draws the logical conclusion that anyone who knows of the existence of the Paris subway is a suspect because he may cause people to doubt that one can do things only in the Bolshevik way. This leads to the final conclusion that in order to remain a loyal Bolshevik, you have to destroy the Paris subway. Nothing matters but consistency. And so what she's saying here is that the only way that, in this case, the Bolshevik, but like the communist system can make sense is to remove all truths that might indicate it's wrong. Like it's either it's right or it's wrong. It's a binary. There isn't a spectrum of belief that exists with, capitalism, for example. There's no opportunity for critical thinking. Like either the Bolsheviks and the Russian system is the best system that was ever created, and all the wonderful things in the world come out of this system, or it's not. And if it's not, that casts doubt into the regime, and then you lose all hold of power. And this is what totalitarian regimes do. They don't just deny the truth with propaganda, but they replace and they get rid of objectivity of truth. And you can see why there's parallels with what's happening in our world today, and why that's deeply terrifying. The only way you can believe in great things within a communist regime is to deny the existence of things outside of that regime. And so that means you have to accept lies to be true in order to preserve the edifice of the regime. And I mean, you can see this with North Korea, right? Why do you think North Korea limits contact with the outside world? Because it's the only way that the regime can maintain power. The moment they see America for what it is, not what they think it is, the entire thing comes crumbling down. And so you have to perpetuate falsehoods. So you have to accept lies. You have to accept false confessions in order for all of that to be true. But the outcomes, obviously, like I was saying, like there was the famines, but the outcomes are consistent across different communist regimes. So you get rid of religion, you enslave the population. So Khmer Rouge had camps. There were camps in China. There's camps in North Korea. There were camps in the Soviet Union. Like camps are consistent. Families are torn apart, so families are told to inform on one another. But you get rid of the family system. You are no longer a member of a family. You're a member of the state, and this is why, conservative people are pushing for family and traditional values, because family is a natural check against the state. And the moment you lose family, you get this. You get communism, which can lead to totalitarianism. Like you lose your freedom. So that's why families are super important. This is great. This is a great quote. So kind of like what I was saying before, there's equality of outcomes in the sense that there's equality and like lowering your quality of life. So Thomas Sowell writes, the history of the 20th century is full of examples of countries that set out to redistribute wealth and ended up redistributing poverty. And that's exactly true. Like time and time again, this is what we see in these regimes. And so this is why I think it's important to talk about it, and it's why I wrote this note here. Like the fact that this isn't talked about in schools means like the educated people aren't learning about it, and if the educated people aren't learning about it, they're here. They're the educated. They were educated, articulate, and convinced they were on the right side of history. Evil usually doesn't look like evil. So the people who are perpetuating these crimes against humanity are the people who have to accept falsehoods. They have to eliminate objective truth in order for their belief in the regime to be true, right? And so they suppress information, they suppress history. They don't want you to learn what actually happened. And their objective isn't for you and I to benefit, it's for them to benefit so that they can become part of this new elite, this group of people who gets to call all the shots. And I think that's maybe what this is all about. It's all about power economically, power politically, power socially. I can't imagine that it's about money. That just seems so vapid to me. And I really don't, if you have any insights into this, I would love to know. Like, I don't know what pushes someone to become a Marxist. Like, why do you profess this? Why, like, what is the end goal? And if the goal is for a utopia, like that doesn't happen. Like, there's no such thing. And we know that from the mouse utopia experiment. I'd recommend watching What If Alt Hiss video. Rudyard Lynch does a good analysis of it. But there was a scientific study done of mouse when given utopian conditions that it devolves into anarchy. So we know, like, biologically, evolutionarily, like, we're not wired for utopia. And then we have multiple examples of communist regimes that led to death and destruction. I asked ChatGPT to pull some of these up because I wanted to know, like, kind of how many people died. So during his Stalin's purges, up to 1.2 million. Holodomor, as many as 7 million. There was also, and I didn't talk about this here, again, like, because it's so much we don't know. Same thing happened in Kazakhstan around the same time with collectivization of farms. I think like 1.5 million people died there. So a lot of people died in the Soviet Union, probably more than the Holocaust. Mao's Great Leap Forward, up to 45 million people. The Khmer Rouge, 2 million people, up to 2 million people in less than 4 years. And then upwards of 3 million people in North Korea, we still don't know. But these are millions of people whose lives and family trees were erased all in the name of communism. And so the question is, like, to what purpose? Like, why are we rejecting this history? Why do we not learn this history? And why do Marxists continue to push for it? Like, what is the benefit? What is the marginal benefit of going from being a have to a have more? You're not going to be like Jeff Bezos. You're not going to be Elon Musk. You're not going to be at the top of the top. But you're not going to be like your average middle-class person either. So, like, the delta in between, like, there's an aspiration of the educated elite to be part of this. And you see it in Washington, right? I think, like, the folks in Washington, this is a great example because I lived there and I experienced this. And there really is, like, a tangible desire to be elite there. Like, it's really hard to describe. But there was like, at least in like Hollywood, like people want to be famous and want to be movie stars because they want to be like recognized as a celebrity. In New York, people go work on Wall Street because they want to be wealthy and they want to have money. But people in DC like do things in the name of doing good, and it's all for like their personal, I don't even know how to describe it, like to become an elite. Like it's all for their personal like image, their personal brand, but not a brand in like the marketing sense. Like they want to be like the person who calls the shots, who's in power, who's like pulling the strings behind the scenes. And I think this is what's interesting about this, because those are the people who are the most educated, if you will. Like they're the ones with the credentials going through the university system, and they're the ones who are suppressing all of this information. No one's talking about this. And so that's why, I wrote this note, because I think it's really interesting to me that we're not learning this, we're not talking about it, and you're seeing college students marching in the streets, waving flags from, I think we're up to now 4 different countries, everything but the United States in these protests. They're spouting these beliefs, arguing for utopia that can't exist, and arguing in favor of a type of regime that I don't think they know the history of, that will lead to famine, will lead to death, will lead to destruction. And I don't think they understand why. And then you have this upper echelon of people who are vying for power, and they're pitting us against one another for all of this to play out. And, to what purpose? To what purpose? Like this absurd, like narcissism, if anything. But in any case, I think this is really interesting to read. Again, this is from the perspective of Pol Pot in the Khmer Rouge, but I think you can see the pattern plays out throughout history, whether you're looking at Stalinism, Pol Pot, Mao, whoever. But I think it's worth learning more and studying more about all of this, because we're not learning it in college. Like you said in the beginning, like you get 155 hours of Hitler, 3 minutes of Stalin, and 0 on Pol Pot. And looking back on my college experience, like I got a lot of Thomas Friedman, Paul Krugman, globalization, why the UN is good, why the World Economic Forum is good. My introduction, my first international relations class on campus, we had to do an analysis of We Didn't Start the Fire, like the song. I didn't learn any of this. I had one economics course, studied international relations, political science, history, Middle Eastern studies. I had one economics course. That was it. One economics course, which obviously doesn't get into the difference between communism and capitalism as economic systems. It's just teaching you basic macroeconomic concepts. So I didn't learn any of this. And in my general ed stuff for my majors, I wasn't taught any of this. Like things may have come up, and like names like Stalin again were referenced, but like this wasn't taught. Yet Marxist ideology was imbued in everything I did and everything I learned. So students aren't being taught this thing outright, but it's becoming part of their vernacular and the ideology, the subconscious ideology and the way they think. And it's because I think intellectuals, kind of what he was saying in this essay, intellectuals have something to gain from all of this by denying facts, by rejecting history, because it reduces the veracity of the belief system that they hold, and that's a very destabilizing effect. But to what end? Like, to what end does anyone gain from this? And I don't know that anyone is calling the shots. There's no like global communist conspiracy per se. But it's really interesting, I think, to dive deeper into like why we're not learning about this and what we can do to learn more. So I think this is going to be interesting. I'd like to watch this. I think it could be really educational. But you guys, I think it's worth educating yourself on kind of what all of this is. Even like, here's a few. Like, pick one and dive deeper. What were Stalin's purges? What did he do? This is all in the lead up to World War II, by the way. Like, we don't talk about this in the United States. We talk about, the Great Depression and, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Like, this was all happening while FDR was president and we were in the Great Depression. So I think it's worth, like, pick one, dive deeper into it and learn more. and get curious about like what communism actually is, not what you think it is, because I think you'll be surprised at what you uncover. At least, that's been my experience so far. If you like this video, please feel free to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. Like, what did you learn in college? Like, did I miss something here? Or like, did you learn this? Did you dive deep into this kind of stuff? Did you cover it? What do you remember from your college experience? And, do you, stuff like this, in recent times, like this was, we haven't experienced this, famine per se like this, but like in recent times, things were covered in the news in a certain way. Like, how do you remember the, last 5-10 years? And do you think it was based in truth, or do you think there was something more to it? I'd love to know your thoughts, so feel free to leave a comment below. But subscribe, and share this with anyone you think who might be interested with it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.